Interesting picture. So what does it look like if you were just to guess what that skull is? An alligator, right? The eyes are in the wrong spot though. But it does look like a lot like a crocodilian, right? This is a fish. So it's an extinct fish, obviously. And it is in a group that we're going to call Sarcopterygians. And don't worry about the word, we'll see it later. But this is one of the intermediates of fish that we're going to move onto land. And this particular fish, most likely because of its skull shape and where the eyes are and the nostrils are, probably hunted a lot like crocodilians do. At the surface where the water meets land, and they hunted insects, right? Really, because the insects at this time were really big. Back in the day that the Temblospondyli were around, the oxygen concentration on Earth was much higher, and it afforded insects to be much bigger. We're talking dragonflies like this, you know, so they could pick up, you know, small children probably. And it's all based on oxygen concentration. Because oxygen levels have dropped in our atmosphere over the last 100 million years, the insects have had to adjust based on size. But these guys were obviously water boundary hunters, very similar to crocodilians, probably ambush hunters. We'll talk about them when we move towards the climax of fish evolution. So this is what is considered an ancestral amphibian, or a very, very specialized group of fish that gave rise to ancestral amphibians, depending on who you read. All right, so here's our phylogeny we've been using, right? So here are our three phyla, right? Cephalochordata, Urochordata, and Craniata. Here are two subphyla, Vertebrata and Hypertridae, which were hagfish. And now we just did our first class, right? Which were lampreys, which were Hyperardia. Now we're going to move this way and start talking about fish, working our way to tetrapods. And the first group of fish we're going to cover are the rest of the cyclostomes, right? The rest of the round-mouthed, jawless agnathans, right? And there are a large group of them outside of the lampreys, which are the only ones alive today. These, obviously, all of these guys here we're going to start talking about, from conodonts to placoderms, are all extinct now. There are no living representatives on the planet today. So the first class we'll talk about is that first one that is called Conodonta, or conodonts, and they look like this in the fossil record, or they have eyes that are up and laterally located, and the eyes are typically really big compared to body size. And they have very stream-like bodies with very well-developed myomeres, right, or myotomes, body muscle, and were very, very, very probably fast, efficient, versatile, and were hunters. Now, what's really interesting about them, and I'll throw a little video up. I found a couple videos that have kind of worked some animations on how they think their mouths worked. Even though they were round-mouthed, they had plates of teeth that were attached, some to cartilage, some to bone. They didn't really have true bone in them, but bone-like tissue. And these plates could move independent of one another. And so the plates move around, which kind of is a different way for evolution to explore being a predator without having a movable jaw, right? And so they had side plates that could move, they had front plates that could move, they had plates that could move back. So you can imagine they could latch onto something with some plates, open up a wound, use two other plates to grab some tissue and then pull it in to eat. And that's kind of how they suction fed, using these plates of teeth. And this is a fossil that's been broken open, so you can see all the plates of teeth. So evolution went really kind of crazy with using these plates of independent moving teeth in order to use as a feeding style. But they were probably pretty voracious little predators. They did have dental tissue, So they had really, really well-developed teeth. They had some cellular or cancellous or spongy bone-ish kind of tissue, but no real true bone. At least, it's not universally accepted that they have any real true bone tissue. They were almost all cartilaginous, and they had enamel and dentin that make up their teeth, which are two ways to lay calcium salts down on collagen that make the tissue really hard, but not very organized. So the one major difference with true bone is true bone's vascularized. It has its own blood supply and can rework itself if it's damaged, right? If you wear down your enamel, does it come back? Not easily, right? Or not at all. Believe me, my dentist tells me I grind my teeth a lot, so I have to wear a mouthpiece, right? Because I grinded my teeth too much, so I don't have much enamel left on some of them. So this particular group has traits of both chordates, early chordates, and vertebrates, but we don't really know where they fit. They seem to be much more complicated than lampreys, but lampreys probably have regressed in evolution. I want you guys to realize that evolution doesn't always have to go forward. It can actually take a couple steps back if the lifestyle the animal's living is successful reproductively, right? So the ancestors of lampreys might have been a lot like the conodonts, very complicated mouths and eating organisms. But lampreys and hagfish have developed lifestyles of being a mud grubber and eating and suctioning dead material or being a parasite, right? And so they might seem simpler, but in reality, their ancestors are probably pretty complicated like these guys were. So typically what they do on a phylogeny is they stick them kind of between lampreys and the rest of ostracoderms because we don't really know where to put them. Not everybody agrees they belong here, but I'm just going with what your textbook says. So now the rest of ostracoderm, or the rest of agnathans, are in this group we call ostracodermii or ostracoderms, which means bony skin, right? This was your extra credit question, which I made it an extra credit question because I only mentioned like 2 or 3 times in lecture, right? So, but this is a huge group of fish that are all extinct. That is, they're pretty diverse. They were a very diverse group. They arose about 500 million years ago during the Cambrian explosion, and then they really thrived through the Devonian period. Okay, so up to about 360 million years ago. So they were around a long time. And they diversified and filled a lot of the niches of the ocean. And they come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, but they're all round mouths, right? They're all cyclostomes or agnathans. Yep.
So from anaspids to osteostracans, those are ostracoderms?
Yes. Yep. From you talking about on the phylogeny?
Yeah.
Yeah. From here all the way. I mean, there's this is ostracans or osteocans is what you're saying? Yeah, so the osteostracans and all of these are ostracoderms. Yes, they're all different groups of ostracoderms. Now, the big thing about these is they were like tanks. They were swimming tanks. They had huge plates that were associated with their heads and their dorsal body surfaces that were made of bone, all right? So bone first arose, true bone, vascularized bone, first arose in this group of agnathans, the ostracoderms, and it arose in their skin. So bone was originally a skin, or an ectodermal, if you will, derivative. And so they had head shields and body shields that were made of bone that made them really hard to kind of take down. It was like armor, right? And it made it hard for them to be fed on, say by conodonts or by other ostracoderms. They still have a very prominent notochord, just like lampreys, just like hagfish, just like conodonts, but they do have cartilaginous blocks that are not ossified, that are not true bone. The only bone they really had was in their skin. They do have a new feature here that lampreys, conodonts, and hagfish don't have. They have paired fins. So in some of them at least, you can see that they have fins that are this looks a lot like a fish, right? like a fish you would see today. It has fins that are pelvic, and there are even a few with fins that are pectoral. Some of them have dorsal fins, and so the fin features start to develop in these groups that allow them to turn, swim better, be more agile, move through maybe crowded environments easier. And these girdles are very similar to what you see in the jawed vertebrates, which are going to develop next. They're very exaggerated. Some of them are probably really slow and not very good at moving very quickly, but they were very protected, kind of like the turtles, right, of the fish world, if you will, at this time. Some had nasal sacs, at least one or two in some cases. A lot of them were even fusiform and very agile and mobile, and some were even flat like a ray. I mean, they were very flat, had flat bodies. They filled a bunch of niches within the ocean because they were the only fish that was kind of moving around at this particular time and very successful. So you can see over here when you look at, this is an abundance phylogeny. And when you look over to the left here are your lampreys and your hagfish, right? Here are your conodons. And these are your astrocoderms down here. So you can see the astrocoderms were much more diverse. There were a lot more of them and a lot more niche-filling occupations as far as these particular fish go. So conodonts are more derived than hagfish and lampreys. At least that's that's what your textbook says. Astrocoderms are very diverse, and true bone first arose in that group. All right, osteoderm or bony skin. Soft-bodied urochordates and cephalochordates are basal to all of these and are sister to the craniata, right, into the vertebrates. Craniates include hagfish and all the descendants of vertebrates. Urochordates are your sister taxon to that, which you've already learned. And then vertebrates apply to lampreys and everybody else. Lampreys, astrocoderms, and gnathostomata, which is the next group. Now, when you look at gnathostomata, which means jawed mouth, and this is a real shark. That's a goblin shark. That's a deep water shark. It's a pretty ugly looking animal. Scary looking, right? The next big invention of evolution was the jaw, which was immediately impactful as far as adaptation goes. And so the group that we call this is called Gnathostomata, and it depends on who you read. Some people call this a superclass. I call it an infraphylum because tetrapoda is in this group, and they are a superclass. You can't have two superclasses. One's got to be bigger than the other one. And so I call this an infraphylum, as a lot of people do. So, because Vertebrate, remember, is a subphylum, right? And then we got class, Hyperoardia, and now we got Gnathostomata. I call an infraphylum because there are classes and superclasses within it. And so these are all the jawed vertebrates, which is basically the rest of vertebrates, right? Including us. And the development of the jaw was an easy thing to do. We already have pharyngeal arches developing in the embryos. They become gill arches in some animals. They become part of the ear in other animals. And the jaw just came from a group of those, probably through mutation and gene expression and the fusion of those pharyngeal arches. Once you get a movable jaw, you become a much better predator, right? All you got to do is add teeth to it, which are already there. The first organisms to develop these are going to be placoderms. And so just to show you what I mean by this, this is what a typical vertebrate looks like early in embryology. This is what we would consider kind of the early organogenesis, the development of organs. All right, and so the first thing that you really see here when you look at an embryo is the enlargement and swelling of all of these structures dorsally, right? On the dorsal side of the embryo. This is the belly side, right? You got a big heart here that's already developed and pumping. And then you can start to see, here's the forebrain, development of the brain. This is the midbrain and the hindbrain. And this is the spinal cord, right? That's going dorsally and dorsally and caudal, right? Away from where the developing head is. Now, if you look underneath the developing central nervous system, you'll see a notochord, right? So, and this is in all vertebrates, notochord. And then under the notochord, near the head, are going to be these clumps of tissue that form that are called arches. And they're called pharyngeal arches. And they're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Or they're called pharyngeal pouches. It just depends on who you read. Now, this is a real embryo right here. This is a scanning electron micrograph of a real embryo here, showing you the frontal, the forebrain or the frontal nasal prominence. This would be the midbrain, this would be the hindbrain. And then you can see here is pharyngeal arch 1, here's pharyngeal arch 2, 3, and 4. These are all give rise to different structures in different vertebrates. Number 1 disappears really quickly because it becomes the mandible, becomes the lower jaw. So it's called the mandibular arch. Here's the heart, here's the liver, here's the little upper limb starting to develop, right? Right here, the little nubbin. Looks like a little mitten, right? It will develop into the limb. And so these are somites down here. Remember those big, huge round balls of cells that are next to the developing spinal cord? Those are run all the way along the embryo as you move caudal. So this arch gives rise to the lower jaw, which is now movable. And now you get mouths on fish. Look at this weird fish. This is a living fish too, something you've probably never heard of. It's called a spook fish or a ghost fish. It's a chimera. It's a type of, it's sister to sharks. It's a really strange group of deep water fish. You can find a lot of species off the coast of New Zealand, for example, where they actually fish for them. So this is a huge change significantly that's passed on to everybody else. If you're following, this is kind of all of chordates, right? So here is my outgroup in this old phylogeny. This is Echinodermata, right? And then you got your protochordates here, or at least some of them, right? You're missing the hemichordate, which would be over here, right? And then you got hagfish, lampreys, conodonts, ostracoderms, right? The groups, these are the agnathans. And then everybody else is a gnathostome. The hinged-jawed and paired movable fins are important here. So you can see with this fish down here, we've got very well-developed pectoral fins. You got pelvic fins back there, which give them the ability to move in three-dimensional space much more effectively. And then obviously the development of the hinged jaw or the mouth, which in sharks is very ventrally located and very caudal as far as its location. So now we can start looking at the groups. And so we're going to we'll do the first group are called the placoderms. All right, placo means plated skin. So again, they're going to inherit some of the traits from the ostracoderms of plates in their skin. Sometimes they're cartilaginous, sometimes they're bony. All right. But all the placoderms, particularly in the head, have these incredible head shields that surround their heads. Like this, look at this. This is a good example of what the fossil looks like. So you could sit inside of the mouth of this fish. This is an absolutely humongous fish. It was the major predator during the Devonian period. It roamed oceans eating everybody. It was the great white of the Devonian period. And these are huge teeth that are attached to bony plates, and you've got a lower jaw, and all of these head shields and dorsal shields are all what we call the plaques, or the large skin bony plates of a typical placoderm. And here are some drawings of what they think they look like, the typical predatory placoderm, and they were this big to 30 feet big. They were an incredibly diverse group of fish. Yep.
What do they eat with teeth that big?
They eat everything. And there were other big fish around. They just ate everybody else. They were the biggest apex predator in the ocean. So they ate whoever was smaller than them, which was everybody. Everybody but them. Now, what's really cool is if you look at the placoderms, some of them were incredible niche specialists. This is a placoderm. It looks like a bug. It's got really weird, long pectoral fins, a very flat body. The eyes moved really laterally, but they have a movable jaw, so they're really strange. Some of them were flat like rays. They were a very interesting group. A lot of them develop claspers, which are these extensions off the pectoral fins, the fins of the pelvis, that are basically the intromittent organ or the male delivery system to deliver sperm directly into the female reproductive tract. It allows for internal fertilization and better control of where my sperm are going, right? Instead of dumping them into the water and hoping they find an egg, I can dump them in the female reproductive tract and they have a much better chance of finding an egg, right? And fertilization happens internally. And this type of relationship with the claspers is how sharks reproduce. Sharks are internal fertilizers. Males deliver sperm to the female reproductive tract using claspers. So hopefully we have some male sharks upstairs so you can see what these look like. I have some pictures of how they're utilized in sharks when we get to the sharks. Now again, this group still has a very prominent notochord. It has paired pectoral fins and paired pelvic fins. And where those fins meet, the cartilage becomes bone, true bone. All right, so they have true bone, which they inherited from ostracoderms, in their endoskeleton. Most of their endoskeleton is cartilaginous though, but it makes sense where you attach your limbs that it's much more stable to have bone there than cartilage, right? So that it provides a better origin, if you will, of where the fins move from. They also have kind of cartilaginous blocks, not truly diverse vertebrae, but when you look at where the fins attached, the vertebrae are much more complicated and fused together into a structure called the synarchial, which means you get 3 or 4 vertebrae fusing together, ossifying, and that's where you attach your upper and lower fins, or cranial and caudal fins. Many were flat, bottom-dwelling animals. Many were very predatory-like. Some were huge predators. They became really, really specialized. That is, they fit all the niches of all of the marine and freshwater environments on the planet through the Devonian period. And then about 380 million years ago, they started disappearing. At that time, that's really when the chondrichthyans started to increase in number, right? Sharks and rays. And the sharks, the chondrichthyes, chondro means cartilage, richthyes means fish. So the cartilaginous fish we call sharks and rays started to replace the placoderms. And when I started teaching in the 90s, we thought that the sharks and rays were just better adapted and they outcompeted a lot of the placoderms. But in reality, there were 2 major environmental events that happened during this time that cooled the earth and caused a bunch of changes in the ocean, which the placoderms were very specialized to inhabit. And when you're a specialist, you don't adapt very well. And so a lot of them started dying out just because they lost habitat. They lost their food source. Chondrichthyes at this time were very small and generalists. And because of that, they were able to adapt to this huge environmental change and actually start refilling the niches that the placoderms lost when they came back after those 2 major environmental events of the late Devonian, early Carboniferous periods. So they leave no living species today, unfortunately, because the sharks and rays filled their niches. Just like when dinosaurs died, we filled it in their spots, right? Yep.
What kind of bone is like the plate?
It's osteoderm. Yep, just like comes from the skin. So it's a very spongy bone, it's very spongy bone-ish. Oh, my favorite group. The next group, the chondrichthyes, cartilaginous fish. So here's a typical shallow water marine stingray, right? And here is one of the most graceful, beautiful open water sharks called the blue shark, and a very dangerous shark. At least if you're shipwrecked, it's a very dangerous shark. So again, here is my abundance phylogeny from the textbook, and we just talked about our Ostracoderms. Here's our Placoderms, right? And you can see here in the Devonian, they were very diverse, and then they just disappear as you move into the Carboniferous period. So late Devonian, early Carboniferous, they completely disappear from the fossil record because of those major environmental events that geared the now diversifying chondrichthyes to fill in niches that the placoderms were dying out as far as environmental change goes. Now you can see the one incredible thing about chondrichthyes is evolution got their form right immediately. They diversified and have stayed incredibly diverse all the way through the rest of Earth history as we move from the Carboniferous all the way up to today. They have two major diversifications. The first one's down here, right, where you can see it's like funnel shaped where it widens. And that's because they now fill in all the niches the placoderms exit. And then when you get to the Triassic period here, notice they kind of fall off. There's another major environmental extinction. And then they re-diversify here in the Jurassic period because they start eating dinosaurs, right, and ichthyosaurs that move into the ocean. And they start feeding on that group of organisms because they're like one of the most perfect predators ever produced by the process of evolution. So this is a picture of a really, really old fossil of a stingray. What's really amazing about it is it looks like a modern stingray. So the rays that live today and the sharks that live today are very derived from what they used to be, but their basic form hasn't changed very much. Their skeleton and what they look like over their evolution. They've simply been shaped a little bit, particularly mouth, teeth, and sensory structures to fit whatever niche they're feeding in. But most of them are perfect predators, so highly evolved. So you can see they basically take over the marine environment in particular. And then as we move over here, these are going to be the bony fish that we'll talk about eventually lead up to us, which are the tetrapods. So modern chondrichthyes. So here's your taxonomy. We have superphylum Chordata, right? Phylum Craniata, subphylum Vertebrata, infraphylum Gnathostomata, and our first class here of next to the placoderms, the living class here is chondrichthyes, and there are two subclasses within the cartilaginous fish. There is elasmobronchii, which means thin-plated gills, thin gills, and elasmobronchs are the modern living sharks and rays. All right, so sharks and stingrays, and manta rays and other rays that don't sting. And then you got this group called holocephalii, which means complete or one-pieced head. And this name comes from that the mandible, the upper jaw, is more fused to the skull in the holocephalians than it is in the elasmobronchs. And what I mean by that is if you guys all seen Shark Week before and they show you slow motion feeding of great whites? They can take their whole jaw and extend it out of their mouth. Have you ever noticed that? So their upper jaw is not really attached to their cranium like ours is, right? Now, holocephalians can't do that. Their mandible is fused to the top of the cranium, so they can't extend it out when they're feeding like a great white can when it's feeding on something large or taking big chunks out of something. So that's where these two different names come from. And so the holocephalians are called chimeras. You guys heard of that word before? It means like it's made up of more than one type of animal because they're really weird looking. So they can have elephant trunks and fins and weird eyes. They don't have stomachs, some of them. They're just a really strange group of deep water fish. They typically live below 1,000 feet, right? And so they live in very weird niches. Now, both of these groups are put together and are thought to be related in some way or sister to each other, right? They share a common ancestor. But I will tell you, there are groups of biologists out there that have studied the fossils that say they are polyphyletic. And so there's not universal acceptance of where they actually fit, even right now. I just teach them together and treat them together because there are enough biologists that say they probably are sister to each other. They use cartilaginous skeletons. They use claspers for reproduction, and they both have serial teeth replacement. So sharks lose teeth all the time during their life cycle, and they create new ones. As much dental problems as I'm having right now, I wish I could do that. All right, so characteristics of chondrichthyans. So as I mentioned, from placoderms on, we have paired fins, right? Pectoral and pelvic fins. We don't have a shark skeleton, which I wish we could get one, but they're either really, 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 really expensive, or you can't get a hold of them. But this is what the dogfish skeleton looks like. So you can see there's not much going on down here, but when you get up to the head, it's really complicated, right? The head has a very complicated structure. Almost the entire skeleton is cartilaginous and light, which is important because sharks don't have the ability to maintain their depth, so they need to be as light as possible so they just don't sink to the bottom like a rock. And so that's why they don't have a bony skeleton. They have a cartilaginous skeleton. There is some calcium support to different parts of the skeleton, though. Particularly the jaws are very bone-like, but not true bone. That's cartilage with calcium support, calcium salt support. That is called tesserae. All right, tesserae are these calcium support deposits in the jaws that help support the teeth. The teeth are very calcium-like, and they do have remnants of true bone in their scales, right, which they got from ostracoderms. What's going to happen from ostracoderms to placoderms is that the osteoderm is going to be reduced into what we call dermal scales or fish scales. And so the evolution of osteoderm is now down into the individual types of scales that you see in fish.